I want to thank Laura Balcom, Harry Daly, Claudio San, all of the people, the sponsors of the Biomedical and Health Sciences Institute, the Biomedical Partnership. As Claudio just said, heading the DigiLab, this is a consortium of faculty on the humanities side who are increasingly interested in the intersection with STEM. So I'm particularly excited to be talking in this series and talking to some of you here who may be on the sciences side. I will say this is my maiden voyage with a lot of this material. I'm still working it out. So I'm greatly looking forward to the Q&A and any feedback that you might have or thoughts that you might have. I have been cloistered in my archive, as historians are wont to do, with my records, but I haven't yet really taken this out to the medical community to canvass their views. So I'm really excited to do that, and this is sort of a first attempt to do that. Okay, before we go too far and jump in our time machine for our throwback therapies, I want to say just a little bit about how important death investigation is. I thought it was important before I started, but the more research I've done, the more I realize how critical it is. We all have a very lurid view, shaped by local news, Crime Stoppers, the CSI series. We have this lurid view of death investigation, I think, that comes from a sort of rubbernecking and a CSI effect. It is true that our MEs and coroners serve the criminal justice system as medical detectives. They participate from the very beginning of an investigation. In fact, an investigation doesn't begin until they find a cause of death, and they participate all the way through when they may be called to testify at trial. That's absolutely true. But dealing with corpses, not patients, coroners and MEs do not always, I believe, get the respect that they deserve for the roles they've also played in the history of public health in the United States. Throughout our history, the coroner has been on the front line in many battles with some of our most mortal enemies, raising the alarm and uncovering correlations and epidemics that no one else has seen. There are hundreds of these examples that I've now found. I won't bore you with that many, but I'll give you just a few. In Pittsburgh in 1907, it was coroners who helped blow the whistle on the ridiculous high rates of industrial accidents in steel mills, forcing local government to intervene. In 1911, it was a coroner at the epicenter of the public outcry for new building inspections and fire safety laws after the Triangle Shirt Factory fire, in which 137 women and girls leapt to their death from a 7-story building. In 1924, in Newark, New Jersey, it was a pathologist performing autopsies for the local coroner that first documented really high doses of radiation in the female employees of the U.S. Radium Corporation. These were girls who were in the habit of pointing their brushes, their camel hair brushes, as they painted liquid radium on the watch dials so that people could see the time at night, resulting in large-scale necrosis of the jaw and chronic anemia. As I say, there are hundreds of these examples. MEs were the first to sound the alarm about needle sharing in 1933 in an epidemic of malaria among New York's heroin addicts. They were the first to sound the alarm about SIDS, AIDS, cocaine-related deaths in the 1980s. They were the most vocal proponents about new traffic laws. As soon as you get a car, you get a human body hurtling at a speed it wasn't meant to hurtle at, you start to get accidents. So it's in the 1930s, and it's coroners who are leading the way and saying, this is worse than anything we've ever seen. Our greatest source of danger to life and limb today is the operation of the automobile, noted a New York ME in 1931. More lives were lost in Milwaukee over the past 5 years from automobiles than all the acute contagious diseases combined, reported a Wisconsin coroner in 1930. And of course, it's death investigators who pioneered the blood alcohol test and begin to link the number of traffic fatalities that are associated with alcohol. So in all these ways, death investigators have helped to put public health concerns on the public radar and deserve to be regarded, I think, as the handmaidens and helpmates of their counterparts in traditional medicine. Granting, then, its importance, and with all due respect for these successes, death investigation in this country has also a deeply problematic history. I grant entirely that modern-day MEs and coroners operate in a very complex environment. It's not always perfectly clear whether they have a legal right to perform an autopsy. if they don't have the family's permission. They have prosecutors demanding, right, that they do a thorough investigation. They have organ transplant people who are on top of them to say, release the body, save a life. They have hard calls to make about assisted suicide and euthanasia. They really are on the front line of many intimate details of how we go out of the world. So it's a difficult environment, I grant. It's a checkered history, too. So, corruption and incompetence have plagued death investigation throughout its history. Whoever controls the coroner's office controls the criminal justice system. The wheels of justice don't turn until the coroner makes a pronouncement. This is a fact not lost on mob bosses, not lost on political machines, as you might imagine. Whoever controls the coroner's office controls whether justice happens or nothing happens. And it's just crickets. In the early 1950s, a man was found bobbing in Biscayne Bay, blindfolded with a knife in his back. The coroner rules it a suicide, undoubtedly pocketing a fee from whoever had been on the other end of that knife. Even when they don't stoop this low, some coroners in the past routinely got kickbacks for steering bodies to particular undertakers, for releasing crime scene and autopsy photographs to the press. Before the 1968 Uniform Anatomical Gift Act, coroners and MEs could harvest organs with relative impunity. Untold numbers were engaged in the lucrative pituitary trade, selling off the organs for the human growth hormone that was so lucrative on the black market. To this day, I think the American people are largely unaware of how large a role cadaver organs played in medicine before 1968. Just give you a couple of examples. One Dallas ME in the 50s was in the habit of dropping dead babies on their heads to learn about injury patterns for child abuse investigations. A Tacoma, Washington forensic pathologist routinely stabbed corpses with a particular knife to help sharpen his testimony for an upcoming murder trial. A Milwaukee ME collected the testicles from the dead to test theories about heroin use and sterility. And it wasn't clear that any of this was particularly illegal before 1968. In fact, I have my students read Mary Roach's Stiff. I don't know if any of you have read that, and they are horrified to find out that if you donate your body to science, one possibility is that you will be decapitated and your head will be used to test cosmetics. So, some corruption. Then there's the question of competence. Death investigation in the United States is one of the least professionalized, least standardized areas of American medicine. It's a sloppy patchwork system in which the older system of the coroner is overlaid by the relatively newer system of the medical examiner. There are important distinctions between the two, even when they're doing the same job. Coroners are not usually required to have any knowledge of medicine, any knowledge of pathology. They are usually both elected and constitutionally protected, making them more susceptible to cronyism and political patronage. They have a very powerful lobby, which makes them very hard to dislodge. The ME system is newer and generally stresses, scientific and medical knowledge and standardization, professionalization, but as we've seen throughout its history, it is not unblemished either. So we have this notion of what's called the CSI effect, the idea that death investigation is fantastic in this country, but in fact, it is overlaid patchwork system that has been very uneven. If you look at the highest profile cases, or some of the high profile cases, for MEs and coroners, they haven't performed particularly well. The most obvious example would be John F. Kennedy. Now, I grant that the MEs in that case at Bethesda Naval Hospital had a tough job, right? So it's the President of the United States that's just been wheeled in. They are under orders. They have their superiors hanging over their shoulders. They have GI men with machine guns standing next to them while they're trying to do their work. At the same time, we would all grant that was a botched job. They didn't know where the wound track was. They only knew that there were 2 bullets, not 4. The resulting investigation would give line inches to folks with incredible theories about what happened on that day for years to come. Another case that some of us might remember was from 1993 in South Carolina. South Carolina has a coroner system. So the coroner in Marlborough County, South Carolina, in 1993 was a part-time construction worker and part-time coroner. So they wheel in a badly decomposed body of an African-American male who'd been thrown into a swamp next to the road. He doesn't have adequate refrigeration, so this guy decides, well, we'll just burn it. So he burns the body. He did manage to save the teeth. Fortunately, investigators then identified the man as the father of the most famous athlete on the planet. It was James Jordan, the father of Michael Jordan. The coroner in that case had given South Carolina death investigation yet another in a long series of black eyes, as he said himself. I guess I've done for the Coroners Association what Tanya Harding did for figure skating. Today, American medical examiners and coroners receive nearly 1 million reports of deaths, roughly 30 to 40% of the whole. Lots of folks die in hospitals. You don't have an ME necessarily, or an autopsy, or a coroner involved. So roughly 30% of the whole of American deaths are referred to coroners and MEs. Those folks accept roughly half of those, means they are responsible for investigating 1 in 6 American deaths. Getting it right in 1 out of 6 cases is the job of the coroner or the ME. And yet, the coroners who serve 42% of the American population have no medical training, no investigative training, no background in pathology. So how did we get to a place where something as important as death investigation is handled by this patchwork system? Okay, well, here's where we jump into our Wayback Machine. Whoa, 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 okay, hold on, wait. That is not exactly what I meant by Wayback Machine, but that, we might as well start here. That is me. And this is, Claudio Sant is exactly right. I was a death-obsessed little kid. So this Christmas present I got. It was this little chattering skull. It was my favorite thing in the world. And I'm amusing my sister putting the ham in Hamlet. So I was absolutely a death-obsessed little kid. The way I figured it, the dead had done at least one thing I hadn't. They'd died. And so strangely, they could teach me how to live, what we needed to live up to, and what we needed to live down. Ultimately, perhaps predictably, if I'm addicted to death, you're not going to do any better mainlining than just go to the source. I found a box of coroner's reports at the South Carolina Department of Archives and History, and I was hooked. I can't tell you what it's like to open a box of these inquests and realize that in each and every neatly tri-folded little bundle, there's the story of how one person went out of the world. Here there are no beginnings, only endings. Every death is different, and yet all are somehow the same. Now the coroner's office, old as death and taxes, related to both. In medieval England, if the sheriff is sort of like the king's guard dog, basically Sikkim, the coroner is the king's vulture. The word coroner comes from corona, Latin for king. The idea is that the coroner is a person who is scouring the countryside to make any money for the king. So if you have buried treasure, suddenly shows up, oh, the king, that belongs to the king. So in comes the coroner. So why deaths then? Well, deaths are an important point at which property issues become unmoored from their owner, and there are great questions as to who is owed what. And the state wants to make sure that it's going to get its piece first. Where the coroner suspected suicide, the Crown could claim the estate. Where the coroner found a dead Norman on the village commons, which evidently happened a lot, the Crown could levy a fine called the murderum, from which the word murder derives. There's this fantastic cartoon from 1826 that depicts, I think, a lot of what we need to know about how an inquest worked, which by then was the sole focus of the coroner's office. I think it functioned not only legally, but as a kind of community theater. I know it's hard to read the caption. It says, "Juror, the man's alive, sir, for he has opened one eye." Coroner, "Sir, the doctor declared him dead 2 hours since, and he must remain dead, sir. So I shall proceed with the inquest." This does such a fantastic job of all the layers of authority that we see at an inquest. Hovering over all is the civil authority, since everyone here is to investigate whether someone has killed, as the language went, against the peace and dignity of the state. We also see the authority of class in the sort of rotund, well-fed, well-fired gentleman who clearly owns the home. We see the authority of medicine in the doctor who's made his pronouncements. We see the authority of religion, right, in the figure lurking just behind him, in that of the priest. But we see the authority of common sense, too, in the masses who may not bring expertise to the table, but they have a knowledge of local circumstances, like in this case, who's died and who hasn't. And I think you also get a little bit of the authority of death itself, which cuts against all of these professional and class distinctions, holding out a certain social leveling, a sense that everybody dies, however unequally. And I think we also get a sense that in this world, at least, their intimate relations with death were much, much closer than ours. Whatever we might say about the disparities of power and privilege that we can see depicted here, all of these people are facing death together in one small space. Just to give you a sense of what these look like when you unfold them, here is a typical inquest. And there's a lot of legalese. It's sort of a boilerplate. It's a fill in the blank. You have to have all of these things to make the inquest work. So you always get a place in the woods near William Gardner's. You always get a date, here the 4th of January in the year of our Lord 1817. You always get a coroner. In this case, that's a justice of the quorum, acting as coroner. You get a dead body, Alexander McKee. Inquests have to take place where the body lies. You get a list of jurors. In the case of South Carolina, that's 14 white males. And you get a judgment. In this case, as in most, following do say upon their oaths. I got very accustomed to this sort of rhapsody of do say upon their oaths, do say upon their oaths. In this case, Alexander McKee was deranged or insane, escaped from his family, and died of exposure in South Carolina. But you get a lot more than that. So that's like the cover letter, if you will, the overlay for the inquest. But you also get, as in this case, a minority report. One member of the jury who disagrees with the majority in its findings. In this case, a guy named Gino had been tasked with taking a slave to the local jail. The slave had already been injured, starving, on the run, wasn't making good time or good enough time for Gino, and so was dragged behind his horse until the body was decapitated. So the rest of the jury is perfectly comfortable saying, no harm, no foul. I don't see anything to do. And this guy, definitely a racist, probably a slaveholder, is saying, whoa, whoa, whoa. At long last, sir, is there no sense of decency? Is there no line at all? So you get a minority report. Even better, you get the words of slaves themselves. Clearly, slaves were not legally allowed to read and write, so this is being written down by someone. But these are her words. This is what she saw. And we have plenty of cases where the jury says, oh, she died of apoplexy. But the slave testimony says, my mother was hit with a shovel. So they can bury it, but they can't bury it forever. It can be discovered. And you also get a sense of who's serving on the jury. In this case, every one of these people have made their mark. Every one of these people are illiterate. We get a glimpse of the poor whites of the South, of whom we have, quite frankly, too little knowledge. Okay, so I think some of the crimes, some of the cases that I've found, you could get from regular court testimony, but especially in the Old South, we get information from cases that had a way of not quite percolating up through the court system. Cases in which nothing actionable had occurred, cases of suicide that wouldn't be investigated by the court, accidental deaths and acts of God, and cases of apoplexy that are in fact being hit by a shovel. Now, obviously, no society should be judged solely by its morgue. I believe every society has to answer for its morgue. And that is my particular point and one of my inspirations. This is the Cold Case Project. This is run by the Center for Investigative Reporting. There's no statute of limitation on murder. So we have lots of cases, 1960s, 1970s, civil rights workers who were gunned down in their driveway. Everybody knows the Klan did it, but it never is investigated. Well, there's no statute of limitation on murder. Let's roll them up. And they have. They've rolled some people up. I can't do that, right? It's the 19th century, everybody's dead. There is a measure of justice, though, in saying, this is what happened, and in naming names. I've also taken a cue from someone who works on this campus, Amy Ross. She does work mostly in Nicaragua, Latin America, with human rights abuses, in which she says, okay, what's step one, actually, in any truth and reconciliation campaign? Count the dead. As I put it, when everybody matters, everybody matters. So that's what I'm trying to do, in part, for the Old South. I also have an historical point. This is a book by a friend of mine, The People and Their Peace, by Laura Edwards. Her argument is that, you know, we think of the FBI, we think of the police as law enforcement. That's what their job is, to make sure everybody is obeying the law. But once upon a time, as she suggests, the law had very short arms. Laws were made at the state level, but at the county level, people just lived their lives, often in the breach and in defiance of law. And there's this great book, Notorious in the Neighborhood, in which Joshua Rothman has pointed out that there were interracial relationships, cohabitation, in the antebellum South. Black and white men and women who loved each other and lived together. And it was common knowledge that they were doing this. It wasn't allowed to be public knowledge. It wasn't allowed to get out, because the people were at peace. What was true yesterday should be true tomorrow. And her argument is that the coroner and these other smaller level officers, their job is really not our idea, death investigation, medical certainty. Their job is something else. There's a rift in the community. The community needs to be healed. It doesn't need an answer, a clinical answer, or it doesn't need the answer. It just needs the peace to be restored. And the coroners have an important role in that. So this is what all of that looks like. So South Carolina Department of Archives and History, big box of coroners reports. I pulled all of that information in. This is essentially what it looked like last year. We digitized. That's never enough. You have to datify. You have to put things in columns so that you compare things to other things. And I know it looks a little dry, but there's a benefit in aggregating data. For instance, we now know that in Spartanburg County, South Carolina, between 1840 and 1880, if you are a white male and the coroner is standing over your body, you died of a combination of alcohol and stupidity. You just got drunk, fell off your horse, drowned in a puddle. If you were a white female, you most likely hung yourself. If you were a black male, you most likely hung yourself. Not were hung by somebody else. You most likely hung yourself. So what you get as a picture of the South is not what we thought, a place of sort of eye gouging and duels and rampant violence. It's actually a place of enormous self-violence, a place of enormous self-destruction. It is, quite frankly, what a social worker would have told me, right? I did this for years to figure out what a social worker could have told me in 10 minutes. Is there rampant alcoholism? Is there massive unemployment? Are there tons of angry white men who don't have anything better to do than beat on people? I'm going to tell you exactly what that's going to look like. And indeed, that is exactly what it looks like. So what I've learned is that in a place that doesn't teach kids to swim, many of them will drown. Thus, on May 5, 1860, a large group of teenagers set off on a May Day fishing party at the Boykin Mill Pond. Their raft hit a snag and more than 25 drowned, including all 5 children from one family. And what I've learned is that in a world without treatment programs or social services, spouses and children will suffer the most. Thus, on September 7, 1857, was a Mrs. Cox strolling a backcountry road when she came across 16-year-old Jane Arnold, stretched out on the ground with a baby beside her, bleeding from its umbilical cord. Arnold called out to Mrs. Cox, who wrapped the dying infant in an apron and took it into a nearby house. Mrs. Cox then returned and asked the girl why she hadn't given birth indoors. Because her daddy was dogging her, the girl said, and had cast her from the house. She seemed to be grieving, Cox told the coroner in a model of understatement, but I don't know what for, whether on the part of her dead child or the abuse of her father. A year and a half later, I find Jane Arnold again, cast out of the house and living in an abandoned school where her latest baby has died of exposure. And what you learn is that in a world without birth control, you'll have a lot of dead babies. In 1870, Catherine Berry, a domestic in the R.C. Poole household, was told that she would be terminated if she wasn't indeed pregnant. And in this massive feat of endurance, she manages to stagger out bleeding to give birth in the potato shed. She casts the baby into the Pacolet River, where it lands at the feet of some fishermen. And finally, you learn that in a world that brutalizes African Americans, some few will become brutes. Enslavement does not magically transform everyone who endures it into savvy, self-sustaining freedom fighters. If we're going to grant the enslaved their full humanity, we must grant that, like any group of people, they occasionally fought, fornicated, and had petty disputes that ended at the morgue. To be sure, as historian Stephen Hahn has noted, the slave quarter produced one of the most radical and transformative politics that America has ever seen, a politics that would go on to bring down a $3.5 billion interest. It is a big deal. But in Coroner's reports, we get a glimpse of the violence that existed within the slave community that we knew had to be there. Thus did the slaves of the Hale plantation turn their children over to Tamar, an enslaved nurse, on their way out to the fields, little knowing that she liked to punish the children by tying them too close to a fire. So I could go on, but you get the picture, right? The view from the South coroner's office is unrelentingly bleak. Taken individually, the deaths are senseless and sad, unredeemed by tragedy. Quite honestly, I've come to the conclusion that's a lot of what death is. We're just not good at facing it, not in the past and not now, and we're not good at realizing that who dies, when, where, why, is the greatest social justice question of them all. So this is what CSI Dixie looks like now. And if we can go, this has not been launched yet, so we are at a staging site. We'll see if we're online. What? I've been upgraded. This is important. I'll try one more time if it doesn't come. There we go. Okay, so everything's been digitized, everything's been datafied. This is part of, I have been for years somewhat deeply unsatisfied by the options that academics have in getting their work to each other and to the public. In fact, it seems like we have exactly two options. I may write a monograph, I may write an academic article. I may not, for credit or for the respect of my peers, do anything else. Well, now I am in a position where I cannot be fired. I wish to do something else. So the idea is that instead we examine how our information wants to live in the world. How does this data, how do these stories, how does it want to be? How does it want to exist? It could be, I will write another monograph again. I will write for a popular audience again. But this wanted to be this, in this case. And it is an archive. And you can go and look at, for instance, all of the acts of homicide that were committed. Let's see, wait. Come on now. So here's every homicide in our sample, and you can go to an individual case. In this case, Aaron, a slave who was killed with a chisel on December 5th, 1852. And you can go and look at his case. There are images from the case file. There is usually a partial transcription. In some cases, we have a whole transcription. If it were only that, though, it seems to me that it would be an excellent project for my companions in library science, but it would not be the work of a scholar. The work of a scholar is someone who wants to contribute to an ongoing argument, who makes a summative judgment about the set of records under review. And so that's what we have here, too, where these things have been, in this case, digested enough that I can tell you, what people were being murdered by, or in the case of suicide, murdering themselves with. And then what I've also done is write in long form about individual cases. In this case, an inquest that was taken in Hamburg after the Hamburg massacre in South Carolina. Remember, there is no justice until the coroner makes his pronouncement. So what do you do the day after a massacre? Historians do a very good job of describing lynchings and massacres and all of these things And I worry sometimes that we are reproducing those crimes, not solving them, not dealing with them. So what does this community do? The day after, you convene a coroner's inquest. In the case of Hamburg, they indicted a future South Carolina governor, a future South Carolina senator, for gunning down African Americans in Hamburg in July 1876. No justice was done. I totally understand that, but there is some justice, some measure in naming names and telling the story. So what I want you to sort of see is how this, I didn't have to make a choice. Is this a monograph and a scholar's argument? Yes. Is it a library project and a data? Yes, it's that too. It's also travel logs, something I probably couldn't get away with otherwise. It's also photography. How does an artist come at these records? How does a social worker come at these records? How might a writer come at these records? How about an historian? I tried to do all of them at once. I didn't want to have to make any choices. So that's where CSID is right now. Now, it is absolutely true, though, that you will get a skewed picture of the South if you're only viewing it from the vantage of the morgue. I think there are all kinds of justifiable reasons to do it, but I often say it's a little like, okay, I want to judge Athens, I'm an alien civilization, and I come down and I end up at Crystal Burger at 4 in the morning. You're going to have a very particular idea of exactly what Athens is. It's not perfectly fair. So is there any way at all, I asked myself, to check how people are dying for the coroner, violent, sudden, a rift in the social fabric, versus how they're dying generally? Enter one of my favorite things in the world, more mainlining for me. In this exact same period, they did a mortality census. The mortality census is one of the lesser known aspects of the census. Aaron Sorkin has this fantastic quote that if you just say the word census, people will start to fall asleep. I think that's true, but I'm sort of the quant geek and spaz who loves things like the census. And when I found out about the mortality census, I was just overjoyed. It runs in 1850, 1860, 1870, 1880, 1890s burns, and in 1900 they found the Bureau of Vital Statistics, which sort of picks up the thread from there and standardizes a death certificate, supposedly. It's not really, but supposedly. But in 1850, what we catch them is in their early phases of trying to gather data about how folks are going out of the world. There's this fantastic book by another friend, Patricia Klein-Cohen, about calculating people. Basically, she makes this argument that Americans became addicted to numbers, to math, to numeracy, as she calls it, in 1790. It's part of what's happening to the economy, right? All of a sudden, precision matters, numbers matter, tonnages matter, pennies matter, and people become very precise about their mathematics. And they, yes, use that to make money, and you have Dickens coming over, Tocqueville coming over and say, wow, this is the most calculating people in the world, because they're chasing the almighty dollar. But they also put this to scientific interests for the first time. And one of my heroes, remember Quants, Geeks, and Spazzes, I love this guy. So this guy was the superintendent of the census for 1850. So in 1790, they have the first idea of a census, and they were like, well, the only thing we need for this is to count heads, because the electoral college. That's the only reason we need to know the population. But you've got Madison, you've got Jefferson, you've got these people who they're scientists, essentially, and they want to know more. They want more data. So they propose all of these things, and it gets starved down. And they keep doing that. And then in 1850, the census just explodes in terms of how he isn't a mathematician himself, he isn't a statistician, but he had, as an interested amateur, a sense of what the census could be, essentially. So Congress is distracted, arguing about slavery. They hire this amateur to do this thing, and he proposes this radical transformation of the census in terms of the amount of information that they're going to take in. So, of course, Congress comes back together and they say, okay, let's see, Mr. Kennedy, what exactly you have for us. And they're actually quite appalled, because among the other things he wanted to do was have a Schedule 2, in which he hoped to capture slaves' names, places of birth, number of children, and whether those children were living and dead, and a whole bunch of other statistics about slavery. The Southern congressmen, as you can imagine, just wigged out about what might be revealed, right? They're arguing slavery is a positive good. It's just totally awesome. This is the system going forward. But as soon as he says, let me collect a little data, they were like, no, that sounds like a horrible, horrible idea. Trying to make a joke of it, Congressman William King made the case that in his experience, the slave woman herself, in 9 out of 10 cases, when she has had 10 or 15 children, does not know how many she has actually had. This amused most of his Senate colleagues, but to his credit, the abolitionist William Seward did not get the joke. There is no woman, with great deference to the senator from Alabama, who can have forgotten the number of children that she has borne. The kind of data that he wanted to collect, I can't tell you how important it would be. Right now, what we have in the slave schedules are not names. They can't do any important work for African Americans who want to trace their ancestry. We didn't get what he wanted, which was a sense of where slaves were born. If we'd known that right, we would have a better sense of the scope, scale, and timing of the second Middle Passage. We all know the first Middle Passage out of Africa, 12 million souls. Jefferson conveniently blames it on the king and his addiction to tobacco. What about the second Middle Passage? Isn't that all on us? 1 million men, women, and children sold down the river to the Cotton Kingdom. We would have had some sense or better sense of that if this data had been collected. Wasn't collected. Schedule 2 is gutted. Nobody notices. You can get the same information out of Schedule 6, the mortality census. And the congressman didn't seem to know it. So this is my hero. So how did it work, the mortality census? Well, I mean, to be honest, let's just say it's the maiden voyage of this endeavor, and it's riddled with problems. So they went house to house in the South, and the census marshal would ask, has anybody died here in the last year? And then if anybody had died, they would write it down, and they would say, okay, how many days was this person ill, and what did they die of, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, this is horrible in a way. I mean, if you want really good data, doing a questionnaire this way is a pretty abysmal way of doing it. First, the census man is just despised because he's the forerunner of the tax man and the government generally. So nobody wants to talk to the census guy in the first place. The other problem is, what do these people that are reporting the data know about how they're not pathologists at all. They don't have the first clue. They haven't been highly educated in many cases. They don't know how people went out of the world. So people in this self-reported data died of menstruation. They died of onanism, masturbation. So that's bad data in a way. I find it amazingly good data if what you want to ask is, what did people think people died of? What did they think death was? What were their death ways? Well, we can take that self-reported data and do things with it. All of this information then goes up to Washington, D.C., where Kennedy and others are like, oh, wait a minute, we're going to have to regularize this somehow. We're going to have to standardize this somehow. So he goes around, he talks to statisticians. It takes 5 years. The mortality census isn't published until 1855. And he talks to doctors. And so what they are trying to start to do is to make uniform death itself. I find it fascinating. This is the period, right? I have a colleague, Stephen Mihm, who's writing about standardization and how important it was. And it's all about screw threads and measurements and all of these things because we are a calculating people. But we don't think that they're trying to make uniform the ways we go out of the world, too. Mostly a good thing, But lost is this other world of how people died. I think there's also going to be massive underreporting. I mean, who is going to say, my unwed daughter died on the birthing couch 6 months ago? Obviously, this person has complex emotions about that and is still grieving and is going to tell that to a stranger. I grant that it has its problems. But they did amazing work. This is from 1860. This isn't from the mortality census, but we always think of the census of 1860 as, oh yeah, that's something that happened in 1860. It's something that happened in 1863. They're compiling these statistics about death. The mortality census of 1860 is being compiled as the federal government is on its back at Vicksburg and Gettysburg and all of these places. These map makers for the mortality census, for the census generally, are constantly being dragooned by the War Department. Hey, come draw us a map. And you can kind of see the imprint of that. So this is one of my favorite maps that shows slave density, population density in the United States. But if you look at the top, it's being sold for the benefit of the sick and wounded soldiers of the US Army. So you get a much better sense of how these things are overlapping. And by 1880, they are starting to be sort of a mature arm of public health, understanding that racial concerns or spatial concerns are mortal concerns. This map is just gorgeous. It folds out of this gigantic book to show us consumption patterns in the United States in 1880 or malarial death in the same year. So the argument I'm making about the mortality census is it may seem like it is bad data, but conception comes before execution. And what they're conceiving that they could be, it's very clear they're groping their way toward what became in 1900 the Division of Vital Statistics, a collaborative effort between the Bureau of the Census and the American Public Health Association. And it's certainly telling that one of the first things that they do with this new Division of Vital Statistics is develop a model law for the certification of deaths. And it's a law that puts them squarely on a collision course with the coroner's office. So what's the point of all this? Why should anyone care? Beyond the fact that this stuff fascinates me, beyond what it might tell us about the past, what value does it have for the present? I'm a big believer that historians work. You can't be presentist, turning the dead into political sock puppets to do your work for you. Your work ought to have present value. Otherwise, why are you doing it? Okay, so what is the present value? What are the takeaways? First, and most obviously, the view from the 19th century coroner's office is unrelentingly bleak. If we want to go back in time to a place where there are no social services, no shelters, no restraints on industry, no access to contraceptives, and no treatment programs for alcoholics, drug abusers, or the depressed or the insane, we can absolutely go back there. But I've been to that world, and it is brutal and grim, and its effects fall heaviest on those least able to bear it and least deserving of more pain. Second, if we grant that who dies, when, where, and how is one of the greatest social justice questions there is, we must have good data. We must not allow industries or entrenched interests or their lobbies to prevent our getting at the truth, and we must follow in the footsteps of our 19th century census marshals, the pioneers who began to see that racial problems were spatial problems, were mortal problems. There's a reason that all of the bodies bobbing in the 9th Ward after Katrina are African American. Third, the undeclared war between coroners and medical examiners has been fought largely to a standstill, quite frankly, without any gains on either side. We need to allow that the medical examiners are right. Exactitude, standards, expertise, professionalization are all good things. We need much, much more of them. But we need to allow that coroners are also partly right. Medical certainty is not the only thing at stake when a community loses someone. And the medicalization of death, our tendency to treat death as a disease and an embarrassment that we can quarantine behind a hospital curtain, is deeply unhealthy. What is wanted then is not partisan rhetoric about states' rights or socialist takeovers. What is wanted is good old American pragmatism. Despite the CSI effect, death investigation in the United States is deeply inconsistent. It needs to be overhauled and then respected as a rightful and critical member of the medical and public health communities. Thank you. We have just a few minutes if anybody has a question or a comment. You can't hurt my feelings. I'm in such early days on this. I just need feedback. Like, that was terrible. Would be great. I will correct course.
Have you concentrated much on lynchings as such, or are you concerned about whether there were ever actual investigations of what happened? I assume nobody was really punished or
right. So yes is the answer to that. And so there's a whole section on the website that is written, but I haven't put it up yet, on coroners, on Friedman and the coroner's office. So what happens after it's not 40 acres and a mule, we know. Nevertheless, African Americans did tend to move in to ghost towns, spur towns, towns that were left behind by the railroad, things like that, where they could buy up buildings relatively cheap and then run a town. Why would they want to run a town? Because then you can control things like the coroner's office. So there's a reason that the coroner's office is one of, yes, the first positions that they get. It's the lowest on the rung of civil service. It's one of the last they let go because it is so key to making sure that the wheels of justice can turn. So do we have investigations of lynchings in a dominantly white community? Probably not at all. Probably not at all. You buy the coroner off, it doesn't even leave the traces that we see of these other things. But in an African-American town, oh, absolutely you do. And so there's a war going on that I hadn't appreciated for control of the coroner's office after the Civil War so that you can at least get something into the official record. It's not going to be justice, but it's going to be something that we can follow up on.
So I have a question in your data collection, and I'm thinking of the other source of information about people dying.
Yes.
And that's in newspapers.
Yes.
And so I wonder, as you go into a particular area, there's a set number of newspapers that are
Right.
operating that, and they're going to have their obituary columns or detailed whatever. How does that information correlate back to what you're looking at?
So we haven't done a thorough job of that yet, checking the coroner's office against other possible sources. Certainly, we've worked with newspapers a lot. Their interest in death is just, their morbid sensibilities is just as strong as ours. So you were very generous to say it's going to be about obituaries. No, it's going to be like the lurid details of horrible, tragic things, often with details that the coroner has leaked to them, right? So no, I haven't checked that against newspapers. The idea of this site, though, right, is that instead of a book that I'm done, I fold the covers, I can never put anything else in there. This thing is constantly evolving. And so it absolutely has the capacity to link in other articles. And we've done that in some cases where we have sort of a case file like Hamburg, where you link in newspaper articles and all, but there's no reason that you couldn't do it for all of these cases. So the idea is that the investigation is just beginning. I'm writing about this handful, but there are thousands of cases that somebody else could do work on and link newspaper articles in with. So we absolutely will do that.
You don't seem to shy away from controversy and controversial topics, so I'll bring up one I hadn't come to this lecture to necessarily to think about, but another current issue on how people die is gun violence.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering if somebody were interested in tracing the views on anything from Second Amendment rights to the reality of how many under what circumstances people die from guns, is there information in your database that would allow them to glean some useful information?
Yes.
And what are your thoughts on that, just from your...
So one of the reasons it is unbelievably morbid, but one of the reasons I collect not just the homicides, but then break it down, was it a chisel, was it a hammer, was it a knife, was it a whatever, is so that you can do, or start to do, things like that. Quickly get all the cases, firearm cases. It's true for suicides too. Suicide methods, they're proving them more and more. And I think there are some things about our gun culture that are incontrovertible. More guns means that you will have more shootings. It's just a fact that nobody should get away from. Back to good old American pragmatism. I wish that we could have a debate about these things that was sort of fair and clear, and there were referees, historians whose job is to just get the facts right and get them down. Then you can do what you want with them, but we go that far. That's what academics should be very, very good at. The same thing is true that I find for suicide, right, is that means creates ends. So in Britain, when they have they use coal to produce all of this natural gas that has a very high carbon monoxide, the suicide rate skyrockets. Not by carbon monoxide, yes, that's true, but I mean the whole suicide rate just skyrockets because you have means and it produces ends. As soon as they drop the carbon monoxide percentage in that, you have fewer suicides. That seems to me absolutely axiomatic. Now, I will say the Old South is a gun-crazy place where everybody's drunk and armed, and so this. No, right. But if you're gonna go back and sort of compare, are we gun nuttier now than we were then? Not there. I mean, everybody's armed to the teeth, and as they say, intoxicated, which is a deadly combination, and angry.
So when did the coroner get called and who made that decision? Can you speak generally about that and talk about it in relationship to race?
Yes.
And gender?
Yes, absolutely. So the coroner, usually it's in South Carolina, remember there was the justice of the quorum, there's a justice of the peace, there's a magistrate. All these are just the poobahs, like the big bugs of the planner culture are basically, if you're a justice of the peace, you will write a letter essentially to the sheriff. The sheriff then writes a letter to the coroner that says, gather 14 men, go meet at this particular place at this particular time, and investigate this particular kind of death. So the thing that I think is interesting is for the antebellum period, right, they find apoplexy, but she was hit with a shovel. They're really not thinking about us 100 years on, being able to look and see and charge this as a crime. They're thinking more about property. So like, they might not see the slave necessarily as people, but for sure this person was worth $5,000 and now has been destroyed and somebody has to get paid. And so the wheels of justice have to turn in that kind of direction too. The other thing I'll say back to Laura Edwards of People in Their Peace, why are women testifying here at a coroner's inquest but not in court? Why are slaves testifying at a coroner's inquest but not in court? Well, because it's about the peace, right? It's about what was true yesterday should be true tomorrow. Who knows what was true yesterday? Well, kids know, slaves know, women know what was true yesterday. They have a sense of what the peace is. They have an interest in the peace, what should be true tomorrow. So what I'm suggesting is that there's, I think, far less covering up in the antebellum period than you might otherwise think. What is in here will scald your hair. Now, after the Civil War, after emancipation, when control of the coroner's office is very, very key, because otherwise a county investigation will trigger a federal investigation, then I think all bets are off in terms of white-controlled coroner's office investigating crimes. But beforehand, they're investigating property damage, if not crimes. So there's more in here than you'd guess.
The coroner's jurors come from the regular jury pool?
They don't. They come from who's ever there. They round them up, and the coroners will talk about riding out to this place where they're supposed to be, and just everybody scatters like squirrels. They just don't want to be roped into this. Or you get some rubbernecking types that want to be there. So it is not a very regularized process. It is just 14 locals who may have knowledge of what happened, or they may be rubberneckers or looky-loos, or they may just be somebody the coroner knows or grabs on the wayside. There's nothing particularly upstanding, civic about it.
I'd just like to make a comment that the investigation of death, which you would think would take place most elegantly in a hospital, is something that has declined over the past many years. So as we made progress in getting people diagnosed and getting them into hospital, there were always unexplained causes of death. And physicians had a great interest in coming down to the morgue and having a pathologist do a thorough autopsy and finding out what they missed. And we always considered ourselves the court of last resort for quality control in a hospital. We had a patient in the morgue, spent the time, microscopic examination. We knew why that patient died. The proliferation of diagnostic technology now with imaging and blood tests, physicians have their own idea about what's wrong with their patient based on all of these ante-mortem technologies, and the interest that a clinician has in even requesting an autopsy. They assume they already know why the patient died. And it used to be fascinating to find really all the other things that were going on with the patient that there was no mention of in the medical record.
Right.
The last thing I'll say is that the rules about medical examination and coroners fall under jurisdictions, and it's not uncommon where there's an ME system for the medical examiner to release cases to the pathology department of the hospital, and thereby getting expert faculty to do these autopsies. In New York City, for example, any death that takes place within 24 hours of admission to the hospital is an ME case. If the medical examiner wants it, sends for the body. If he has a relationship with a pathologist in the hospital, they order it in spite of family wishes. You can't just die in the hospital within 24 hours and have somebody write on the death certificate, stroke, okay? Somebody's gonna, you know, examine that brain. And that varies tremendously. So the practice of pathology and the role that it could play in terms of maintaining a high level of quality of diagnosis is really being lost.
I agree.
And that also follows the reimbursement for it. I think now perhaps Medicare won't even pay for an autopsy. So nobody, you know, wants to do it. Families aren't going to pay out of pocket.
Right.
So that's my comment.
So I think we may need to
Okay.
get out of the room, but I'd say that there's a reception outside,
Oh.
and so everyone that wants to talk to Steve some more, please meet him outside. Let's thank him once again.
Thank you all very much. I really appreciate it.